For as long as humanity has taken to the skies, we've heard strange tales of ghosts and supernatural encounters in the clouds. But those who hear these stories are often skeptical. Ghosts are rarely seen by more than one person, and never by entire groups. Yet, the story of Flight 401 is different. In this chilling tale, over 100 people witnessed the unexplainable. This isn't just a story about a crash, it's about what haunted the skies afterward. And the haunting wasn't just about fear. Sometimes, spirits have their reasons. It was December 29, 1972, when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 took off from New York's JFK Airport, heading south to Miami, Florida. The captain that night was Charles Lofton, a veteran with years of experience, and the first officer was James "Jimmy" Garland, a man known for his composure and steady hand under pressure. Alongside them was Don Repo, a seasoned flight engineer. This was a team that knew their job well, and they'd performed hundreds of flights like this one. The holiday season was wrapping up, and the flight was packed with families and travelers hoping to soak up Miami's winter warmth. The cabin was bustling with chatter, laughter, and the occasional murmur of excitement. Stewardesses moved down the aisles, serving drinks, snacks, and offering a warm smile to passengers. Everything was normal until the plane began its descent toward Miami International Airport. As the plane approached the landing strip, Captain Lofton noticed something strange. The landing gear indicator light, which should have shown green, was dark. Without this light, they had no confirmation that the wheels had lowered into position. It was a minor malfunction, one that could have been just a simple bulb, but the consequences of landing without proper gear were catastrophic. The pilots decided to circle over the Everglades while troubleshooting the issue. "Jimmy, can you take us to 2,000 feet and level her off?" Captain Lofton asked, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, sir," Jimmy replied, adjusting the controls and guiding the plane into a holding pattern. The flight attendants reassured passengers that everything was fine, attributing the delay to minor technical adjustments. Lofton and his team ran through the checklist, meticulously checking every switch and system that might be affecting the landing gear light. After several minutes, they decided to engage the autopilot and go down to investigate in the avionics bay, a small space beneath the cockpit where certain controls could be checked manually. In the midst of this, however, something went terribly wrong. Someone inadvertently nudged the autopilot switch, causing the plane to disengage from its holding pattern and begin a gradual descent. In the darkness over the Everglades, no one noticed the slow but steady decline in altitude. Moments later, a warning light finally flashed, alerting the crew to their dangerous descent. By then, it was too late. The impact was sudden, catastrophic, and brutal. The jetliner plunged into the dark swamps of the Everglades, sending twisted metal, luggage, and passengers into the muddy waters. Fire and smoke erupted, illuminating the surrounding marsh for miles. Of the 176 passengers on board, 101 lost their lives, including Captain Lofton and his beloved crew members Jimmy Garland and Don Repo. But the tragedy of Flight 401 didn't end that night. As time passed, whispers began to circulate that the spirits of Lofton, Garland, and Repo had returned, perhaps unable to find peace. The story might have ended there, if not for what came after. The airline salvaged parts of the wreckage, including various mechanical components from the cockpit and cabin, to reuse in other jets. At the time, no one thought twice about using parts from Flight 401 in other aircraft. After all, it was efficient, and the parts still worked perfectly fine, or so they thought. But within weeks, strange reports began to surface, especially regarding a new route taken by Eastern Airlines Flight 318, which had been refitted with numerous parts from Flight 401. Flight attendants began reporting unexplainable occurrences. Some claimed to see shadowy figures seated in empty rows, or felt cold drafts, even in perfectly climate-controlled areas of the plane. But what happened to flight attendant Lisa Henson would forever change the perception of Flight 318. Lisa was a seasoned flight attendant, known for her unshakable calm and dedication to her work. During a night flight from New York to Miami, she was making her rounds, checking on passengers and adjusting items when she noticed something peculiar. In row 13, there appeared to be a man seated alone, dressed in what looked like a pilot's uniform. "Good evening, sir," she greeted him, pausing with a friendly smile. "Is there anything I can get you?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he simply looked straight ahead, his eyes distant, almost haunted. A cold shiver crept up Lisa's spine as she took in his appearance. His face was pale, almost translucent. She blinked, and the man was gone. Bewildered, she looked around, but row 13 was completely empty. After the flight, Lisa mentioned the encounter to her fellow attendants, half expecting them to laugh it off. But to her surprise, others shared similar experiences, each describing a man who resembled Don Repo, the engineer of Flight 401. The incidents didn't stop with sightings. Soon, attendants and passengers alike began hearing warnings. On one particularly eerie flight, an attendant named Grace was alone in the galley when she felt an intense chill. She turned, expecting to find a door open, but instead saw a faint reflection in the metal panel of the oven. A man appeared in the reflection, his mouth moving as though he were speaking. Grace froze as she watched him gesture toward the engine, his face lined with concern. "Careful," he seemed to whisper. "Fire. Danger." Terrified, Grace ran to find the flight engineer, who returned with her to the galley. To her horror, he recognized the face. That's Don Repo," he said, his voice trembling. He didn't explain further, but Grace knew the engineer had been deeply shaken. These warnings became more specific, and some even life-saving. During another flight, a sudden engine malfunction threatened to cripple the plane mid-air. The pilot and crew scrambled to locate the issue. Then, in a hushed, almost whispering tone, a voice was heard over the cockpit's intercom. "Check the second engine. It's running too hot." The voice was unmistakably that of Don Repo. Following the mysterious instruction, the flight engineer located an issue that could have resulted in an engine fire had it gone unnoticed. He managed to contain the problem, and the plane landed safely. This unexplainable experience rattled the crew, who struggled to understand how Repo's voice had come through an intercom that wasn't connected to any external feed. Word spread quickly among Eastern Airlines employees. Flight attendants, engineers, and pilots all shared stories of their encounters, of warnings that saved lives, and of shadowy figures appearing in reflections or empty seats. Some passengers began to hear about these incidents, creating a mixture of fascination and fear around flights containing parts from Flight 401. Soon, people were avoiding these flights altogether. Finally, the airline's upper management took notice. Faced with mounting fear and morale issues, they made a decision. All parts from Flight 401 would be removed from active aircraft. The idea was to quell the haunting experiences and restore confidence among their staff and passengers. As the parts were gradually removed, reports of supernatural events began to fade. However, there were still whispers that some parts of Flight 401 had made their way into other planes without official records, leaving open the possibility that Repo and his fellow crew members might still be out there, watching over the skies. But the story didn't end with the removal of the parts. On one of the last flights to contain remnants of Flight 401, a strange event occurred that would cement the legend of Don Repo. On a night flight from New York to Los Angeles, the cabin was quiet as passengers settled in for the long haul. Lisa Henson, now an experienced attendant, was back in service, although this time with a lingering apprehension she couldn't shake. Halfway through the flight, a passenger reported seeing something strange near the back of the plane. Lisa reluctantly went to check, and what she saw sent chills down her spine. There, sitting quietly, was the ghostly figure she had seen before, The same man from row 13. Dawn? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure nodded, and Lisa felt a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't know why, but she felt that he was there to protect them, to offer a final warning. She listened closely, but all he did was look toward the cockpit, his face somber. When Lisa returned to the front, she mentioned her encounter to the flight engineer. In a move that seemed absurd but felt necessary, they decided to make an emergency landing for a quick inspection. What they found in the engine bay confirmed their worst fears: a loose wire on the fuel pump, a flaw that could have caused a devastating fire. The plane landed safely, and the passengers were transferred to another aircraft. But for Lisa, the message was clear. Don Repo's spirit wasn't just lingering for its own sake. He remained with these flights to prevent a tragedy like Flight 401 from happening again. Today, Flight 401 is remembered not just for its tragic crash, but for the strange legacy it left behind. Don Repo and his crew might be gone, but to many, their spirits continue to fly with the airplanes that share their parts. Whether or not these stories are real or imagined, they serve as a reminder that sometimes, even the greatest tragedies can leave a lasting impact not just on those who survived, but on those who came after. In quiet moments during night flights, when the cabin falls silent and shadows stretch across empty rows, some attendants still claim to see Don Repo sitting there, watching over them. His ghostly presence, far from frightening, brings them comfort, for they know that he isn't there to harm, but to protect. So, if you ever find yourself on a lonely flight, and you feel a chill or catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of your eye, don't be afraid. You might just be seeing the silent guardian of Flight 401, a man who gave his life to the skies, and whose spirit, some say, still watches over those who travel above the clouds.